Hello everyone, and welcome to Building Hoist Episode 2. Today is a slightly longer episode than usual, so I've put timecodes into the description below in case you want to jump to the part that's of most interest to you. We're going to get started with Sanity, creating content types and adding data in. We'll be pulling that data out into our Gatsby app, both for generating new static pages as well as adding into existing pages. And finally, we'll have a look at Sanity's advanced image cropping features and hotspot functionality for creating great images for your websites. Let's get started. So if you've watched episode 1, you'll know that we've integrated Auth0 already. We have a login mechanism, and we have an accounts page that shows us the information that comes out of the JSON Web Token. Made a couple of changes to the website just because I wanted to push them into production. Let's take a look at where we're at the moment and what we're going to look at today. So this is the current production site running at hoist.earth. And I've added this extra build tab here. Now the homepage has changed slightly. We don't want the login mechanism anymore because we're not ready for people to actually sign up. That's for our development purposes. But I wanted to allow people to find out more about the streams that I'm running and the ways they can get involved beforehand. So this build hoist with us basically takes you to the build site, and the join the community, it takes us to the community site, which I'll load up in another tab. So under build, I've basically got two elements at the moment, a couple of streams that happened in the past week, and I'll be adding more to that as time goes on. And then we've got the forum here, which is running at community.hoist.earth, and that's where I want people to get involved and give ideas on what kind of programs we can support or how to make the platform that we're working on better. So I'll close that. We're now on our local development environment. You can see our accounts tab is back in there again. We've got our login and sign up. And if I go ahead and log in, we can then go over to accounts and we can see what we saw at the end of last episode, which is basically the information that's come back from the JSON Web Token. So we're at a point now where I'm not going to touch anything on the Gatsby app just yet. What we want to do in this episode is add some information to the bottom of this page that tells us a bit more about the programs that are being supported. So for that, we're going to use Sanity. The Sanity is a headless CMS. That is, there's no real interface for the CMS, and the CMS doesn't provide any views into the data other than via an API returning JSON. We're going to download Sanity Studio app, which we run locally, which allows us to configure the content that we want to store in Sanity, to upload that into their cloud service, and also to configure their GraphQL endpoint to understand what our data looks like. So that then from our Gatsby app, we can make a request via their APIs to pull via GraphQL the data out that we want to display in our app. So all the data is in the cloud, all the data is managed by Sanity, but the interface that we use for entering the data and the mechanism by which we display that to our users, those are both applications that make use of Sanity's APIs. The only thing you can do through Sanity's web interface is to create an account and manage your account. And we'll have a look at that a little bit because we're going to need to get some API keys out in order to be able to talk to the Sanity API. Let's jump in and create an account. Sanity comes with a command line interface client. If you look here, we can just run an npm install for the Sanity command line interface. I already have that installed, so all we need to do is create a new directory and run Sanity in it. Let's do that. So let's jump into our project directory, and in here we're going to make a directory called Sanity, and in here we're going to run Sanity init. Now this is the first time we're running this, so we need to create an account. I'm going to jump down and choose to create an email address and password account. This is going to load up a login page in my browser. I'm going to switch over to sign up here to create a new account. And the reason why I'm using email password is I want to use the opposite hoist.earth email address. We'll just let one password manage the passwords for us. We'll save that and sign up. I'm not going to save that in the browser. I'm going to accept the terms of service. I'm not interested in joining the newsletter at this point. I've actually done this process once before and subscribed because I'm sure there's going to be some interesting information coming through. But I don't want to be on there twice. So I'll continue this. We should get a success. I'll close this tab. We jump back to the command line interface, to the terminal, and we can see here the login is successful. So we're authenticated now. We're going to give the project a name. I think Hoist, probably quite sensible. So we'll call it Hoist. And it's going to ask us whether we want to use the default configuration. By default, it's going to call our dataset production. Now with the free tier will allow us to have two datasets. So I envisage at some point in the future maybe needing a QA or a testing dataset. But for now, I'm quite happy to stick with the name production but the default is also going to be a public dataset. Now, I'm not entirely sure what my usage is going to be down the track for this, but at the moment I know that the main thing I want is for Gatsby during the build process to talk to Sanity, pull down the information in order to build the static pages based on the content in Sanity. But that happens in build time, which is either going to be in the production build process, which could be on Netlify or Vercel or whichever hosting platform we use, and it can also be in the development environment. But those are both trusted environments, so I'm happy to put the secret key, the API key required to talk to Sanity in order to be able to get access to this private dataset. Whereas if you were, for example, running a React app and you wanted to pull the data out directly, you'd probably want to have one of the datasets as public at the very least, so that your Gatsby app can request that information. Obviously that's coming directly, those requests would be coming directly from your users' browsers, and you can't have secrets in there without them naturally being exposed. We're not going to be doing that at this stage. Maybe in the future if we do, we can either take our production dataset and make it public, or we can use the second one as a public dataset. But for now I'm going to create a production one, and it's going to be private. So I'm going to say no to this, because while I do still want to call this one production, I want to change this default from public to a private dataset. So we'll do that. So I'm going to create the dataset for us in Sanity's cloud environment. And it's going to ask us where we want to output the project. And that's going to be our interface for actually putting the data into Sanity's cloud. So I'm going to say yes, this is the default directory, our current directory. I'm going to say yes, and I want a clean project here with no predefined schemas. We could have some predefined ones. There's movie, e-commerce, and blog as examples here. We want to start from scratch. I know that I'm going to have a schema that's going to contain information about the programs that we're supporting and also the subscriptions that people can subscribe to. So let's start with a clean one, and it's now going to start installing this application. Let's just fast forward this bit. Okay, so that took probably about a minute. Do I want to get an invite to join the developer community? I think this might be the Slack community. I'm already a member of the Slack community, so I'm just going to say no at this point. But I would highly recommend joining. It's a great community to be a part of. So we have the app running now locally. We could just run npm start right now. And what this is going to do is start the Sanity Studio on port 3333. So let's jump in and have a look at what this looks like. So let's log in. We haven't defined anything. Right. So I'll leave that running in the background, and let's open another tab. And now I'll start code with the local code base for our Sanity Studio. The things to take note of here are the sanity.json file, and in here it defines that the schema for our data, for our dataset, is defined in schemas/schema. We look in schemas here. Under schema, we have a default dataset, but there's nothing really defined in here. First thing I'm going to do is clear up some of the comments here, and the documentation will help you understand what's going on here, but I just want to clean this up so it's easier for us to read. This is where we're basically concatenating all the existing types, and there are default types like images and strings and various things you'd expect to come out of the box. These are all defined as types already. And onto those types that we've imported here from the base schema, we want to add our own content types on top. So we can define a number of objects in here, and each will require a title. In our case, we want a type for program. Each of the programs that we're going to be supporting needs to be in the database. The name of this type we're also going to call program. This allows us to refer to that anywhere else. You could technically have a data type that contains a program. And in fact, we'll be looking later on where we have an image as a data type as part of this program. So we'll give the title program, name program, and the type of this schema type is going to be a document. This is a fuller bit of information. A string would provide you just the ability to store a string. In this case, we're going to be storing a whole document of information. And this is going to contain a number of fields. So the fields is going to be an array. And inside this program, we want to store things like the name of the program. So we have here a number of objects again, and the title will be name. The type, or the name rather, is going to be name as well. and the type will be a string. We're going to be storing a string in our program, which is going to have the name, the way we address that in our code, name, and the title, which is going to be displayed in the Sanity editor, the studio of name as well. So we now know that that's where we're going to be storing our name. Other field types we need are slug. Now slug actually has its own types. We want a type called slug. And the advantage of using the type slug is that we can have a generator associated with this. So you can provide additional information for this type, and most of the types allow you to provide additional options. And in this case, the option that we want to specify for slug is the source. And what we're saying here is take the source, which we'll say is name, so that's this part here, take the value that's in name and use that to generate the slug. And we'll see that in action in a second. Let's add some more content types. So as well as name and slug, we want a description. And this one's going to be text. String is like an input field and text is like a text area. So we want more information in here. What else do we need? We'll want some content. So the description I'm imagining is a short description that's used in a list view when you're looking at multiple programs, whereas the content is the actual content of the page if you're looking at the program page. And the other bit of information I want to add in for now is going to be a flag. And we're going to call this highlighted. So I envisage having on our homepage a number of highlighted programs that we want to highlight to emphasize to people who are looking at the page. But also, say for example, we've got 20 programs, but only 3 of them are highlighted. We're still going to have individual pages for each of those programs, which is where people can see the content about that, a bit more information, but we might only highlight a few of them. So we're going to define this one called highlighted. And the type here is going to be a Boolean. It's going to allow us to set it to true or false. So let's save this. And you'll see in the background, it's already reloading the Sanity Studio environment. And now we have this program content type. There are no documents yet. So let's create a new entity or a new entry of type program. We're going to call this one program1. Now the generate button isn't missing, and that's because I didn't put the plural. This is options, not option. So if I save that again, this is now going to rebuild and reload, and you'll notice that it's automatically kept all the information. It knows we're creating a new one already. It's called program1. We've now got this generate button, which, as we defined before, is going to be based on the name. So if I hit generate, it automatically pulls out the name and creates a slug version of that. We're going to have a short description here about program1, and then we've got some longer content. I'm just going to go to lipsum.org, which will allow us to copy some lorem ipsum into our page. And let's just go down, generate some lorem ipsum. We'll copy this first paragraph and we'll put that in here. Now we've got some content in there. Highlighted, you'll notice the little slider here is right in the middle, and that's because currently it's undefined. We can probably define a default, but for now I'm just going to say this one's going to be highlighted. Let's publish that. Great, so that little draft icon there has now disappeared. I'm just going to quickly add 3 more programs so that we can have 3 that are active and 3 that are highlighted and 1 that isn't. So this one here we're not going to mark as highlighted. And now we've got 4 programs. Program 4 is not highlighted. Now, the other thing that I want to do, though, is I want to add an image in here. And there's an interesting thing we can do with images. By default, an image that's uploaded is usable just as an image, which sounds obvious, but Sanity includes this fantastic mechanism called hotspotting, which allows you to define an area of an image of interest so that Sanity can dynamically resize and crop to different aspect ratios the image that you need based on the GraphQL you provide, but focus on the spot that's important. Now imagine you've got a large photo and you want to get it into a portrait view. What would normally happen is you would lose equal amounts on the left and right. For landscape, you'd lose equal amounts top and bottom. But say, for example, this image here has a photo of a person and the person's on the right-hand side here. Now, if you cropped across that way, you'd lose that person. Whereas if you can define the hotspot being here, then Sanity, when it does the resizing, can favor that and actually create a portrait that contains the information in the image that we want to focus on. So let's have a look at how that works. One thing I'm going to do first is this document here, the schema.js, is going to start getting quite long. We've already got one element in here, the program, and we're about to add an image inside here. Now, an image by itself can just be an image, but it can also contain fields such as a caption, and it also has other information such as should it allow hotspotting. So what I want to do is instead I'm going to take this definition here for the program out. Let's get rid of that. I've just copied that or cut that into the clipboard. And let's create a new file over in schemas here. I'm going to call this one program.js. And here we want to basically export default and then paste that in there. So that's exactly what we just typed. I'm going to save that. And now in schema.j up here, we're going to import program from program. And then in here, I can just say program. So this is now exactly the same. I've just hit save. Come over here, we'll see it's reloading, and Sanity Studio locally still knows everything about the program. That's great. So now what I want to do is I want to create another one, and we're going to call this one program image. So I want to define a content type called program image, and this image is going to be inside the program. So we're going to export default, and in here we're going to give it a title of program image, a name of program image. Now this name is important because this is how we'll reference this type inside the program. We're going to give it a type of image, and we're going to define some options on this content type of type image. We're going to say that hotspot is true. Now we also want to define some extra fields on here, so I'm going to create a fields array, and in here we're going to contain two objects, two bits of information we want to store. We want to have a caption, that's going to be a string. The title, which I'll put up here because that's the normal ordering that we've been using so far, is caption. Got to put that in first. And now here we can have some options as well. So let's create an option here. It's called is highlighted. Now, not to be confused with the highlighted field that I created in program. This is whether or not the field is highlighted back in the edit page. So when we're editing the program, when we select the image, in the same area we'll be able to put in the caption. That's what the highlighted does. The next field that we add in, I just need to say that's true. The next field we'll add in, we won't make highlighted, so that'll only be editable once we're editing the image itself. So this one we're going to give the title attribution. The name is going to be attribution, and the type is a string. So make sure all my commas are in. I like to put these commas in at the end of lists as well, because your diffs are going to be a lot easier to see if you make changes in the future. So we'll hit save on that, and we come back into schema here, and now we want to import program image from program image, and we'll bring program image in here. Now the only other thing we need to do is to embed this program image into our program. So after the description content, before we say whether or not it's highlighted, let's add another object in here, and we'll call this one image. The name is image, and the type is program image. So if I hit save, and we jump back over here, it's going to rebuild and reload, and we have an error here. Valid types are program. That's because we haven't saved the schema.js yet. So if we save that now, we've pulled in program image, and we'll notice down here we now have this image. And remember how I mentioned caption is highlighted, therefore we'll see it here. As part of this image block, we can now define the caption from this point here. Let's select some photos to upload for our programs. I've got some images here that I prepared earlier. The first, second, and fourth are the same aspect ratio, even though the fourth is rather larger at 1900 by 1440, the first two are 1024 by 768. And then we've got a 1920 by 1080 image here. The main reason why I chose images of different sizes for this example is that often we don't have images that are exactly the same sizes, and typically we'd have to resize them for specific use in certain areas of our websites. What I want to show is how Sanity's image manipulation functionality allows us to use any images, specify the points of interest, and allow our application to get exactly what it needs in the dimension that it needs it at the time that the image is requested. So we're looking at program 4 here. I'm just going to upload image 4 over here. Now, once the image is in, we can go in and edit, and we can enter the attribution here, but the hotspot is missing, which is probably due to a typo. So let's just jump back over into the code, and yes, host spot is not the right, it should be hotspot. Let's just save that. This will then reload. So now if we come down and we click on edit, there we go. So we can see now here we've got the area that should be cropped. So we can say for this particular instance of this image, because this image could be used in other places as well, in other programs, we can say we always want it to be cropped to this area here, for example. And then we can specify that this area here is the point of interest. So on the right hand side, you can now see that the portrait view makes sure that this town is always visible, and the landscape view makes sure that it's always visible as well. So we're able to programmatically, or Sanity is able to programmatically give us an image of the dimensions that we want, and we can specify any dimensions. These are just examples for the preview purposes. So let's say we want that, and we're gonna hit close here. So we're going to publish that. We'll come in and just do some of the others as well. So now we have 4 programs in Sanity. We've got the images. We could come in and edit this one as well and put a hotspot on this spot here, for example. And we'll close that and publish those changes. So program 1 and 4 now have a hotspot. Programs 2 and 3 don't. Programs 1, 2, and 3 are highlighted. Program 4 isn't. So now what we want to do is update our Gatsby app to pull this information out. But so far all we've done is we've taken essentially JSON data, which is what our application is posting up to Sanity, and also some binary data in the shape of these images. The Sanity API doesn't understand what the structure of this data is to the extent that GraphQL queries would be able to pull that out. So what we can do is we can use the Sanity Studio application to deploy the GraphQL information to the cloud so that our Gatsby app can then use GraphQL to query from the cloud. So that's quite simple. We jump into our command line here, and we basically run Sanity GraphQL deploy, and this will now build the GraphQL and deploy it up into Sanity so that our applications can make use of that. It's going to ask us whether we want to create a GraphQL playground. The Gatsby app that Hoist is built around has a playground built in as well. I'm just going to say yes to the default here, but we'll be using the one that's built into React. So we've now deployed that, and we've got our Sanity endpoint here. So let's jump over now and configure React. So our application is running over here on port 8000, and our code is here. The first thing we need to do, let's stop Gatsby develop running in the background. We need to install some new modules. So the main thing we need to get in order to pull the information out of Sanity is the Gatsby source Sanity module. This is going to give us access to the Sanity SDK, which connects to the API and pulls the information out we need. Right, once that's loaded, we now need to come into Gatsby config, and we need to define a new plugin here. We actually need to define an object of plugin information. So the thing we need to resolve is Gatsby source Sanity, and the options that we want to pass into this plugin are the project ID, which is the project that we're working on, the Hoist project that we created in Sanity. We need to store this in a place that's going to be configurable for the different environments. So obviously we'll create some environment variables around this. So that'll be in process.env and we'll call this Gatsby Sanity project ID. If you remember from the first episode, we have these Gatsby prefixed environment variables over here, because when Gatsby builds the application, it'll only provide any environment variables that are prefixed with Gatsby underscore through to our React app. Obviously, for Auth0 login, the application needs access to the domain and the client ID. In this case, our front-end application, the React application, is going to require access to the project ID. It's also going to need access to, as will React, it'll also need access to the dataset. So that's the name of the dataset that we're pulling the data from. So we'll pull that from process.env.gatsby sanity dataset. One of the things that we need to define that only React uses, so we won't put the Gatsby prefix on there, React is going to need a token to connect to the API. Remember, we created a private API endpoint. So it's going to need a token to connect to the API in order to pull that information out. So we're still going to store that in the environment variables, but here we'll just call it our sanity read token, which we're going to need to define. Now, another thing that we need to do at this point here is, so far we've been using the .env.development file name over here, which Gatsby will use automatically. Gatsby is built to use the env.development file during build time when you run Gatsby develop. One of the downsides to that is the point at which those environment variables are pulled in is not, it's after the point at which we use them here. So we're actually going to need to use a different module to pull in our environment variables. And we're going to use for that the .env module, which, oops, that should be without the dash, we'll install .env. So this is a module which, if you've done any Gatsby or React work before, or JavaScript NPM work, you've probably come across it. And it's a really easy way to pull a .env file in to your application and have those environment variables available to you. The way we're going to use that at the top of the config file, which is where we're going to then, it'll be available to the rest of the application, is we're going to require .env, and we're going to call the config method on that and pass in no parameters. So we're just going to use the default configuration for .env, which means we also need to rename our .env.development file to just .env. And now the .env module is going to be able to pull those in during build time and use those. So the next thing we need to do is define the variables that we just put in over here. Let's just copy this and paste that in here. So we want to define these three elements. So let's have a look at the Sanity website now to get this information out. So if we log into Sanity, we need to provide the email password combination that we used before to sign in to the API. Now we're signing in. Looks like they use single sign-on. That's perfect. So I've already got a session with a single sign-on login mechanism, which means that I'm straight in here. So we've got our application here, which is the project rather, which is the project we created from the command line. If we click through on this, we'll see the project ID right up here. So I'm going to copy this, and we'll come back into the code and we'll paste that in there. Then we need to know what the dataset is. So we named it on the way in anyway. And we can have a look on the datasets tab here. It's called production. So we're just going to say we're going to use the production dataset. And finally, we need a sanity read token. So for this, we need to head over to the settings tab here and down onto the API section, which is where we can define our token. So we're going to create a new token here. It's going to be read only. And the name I'm going to give it is the Gatsby build read token. This can be whatever you like, but it makes it easier for us to be able to see in the future what the token was for, so that if we need to revoke it, we know which one to use. So I'm going to copy this now, and I'm going to paste it in here. I would also recommend that you store this, because you'll never be able to get it back again. Store this in a password manager. Let's jump back in over here. We close that and we can see our token here. And the only thing we can do now is, as I say, you can't get the token back. but we can revoke it in the future if we need to. So let's hit save on that one, and we'll hit save on this one. So we now have the ability to query Sanity when we need to create some pages. So let's jump down into Gatsby node here. And what we're going to do is define a page creation mechanism that will generate pages for us based on the information in Sanity. What we're going to use for this is export.createPages. Exports. The variables we need access to are the GraphQL object, and we also need to know what the actions are during this create pages call. So we'll define here, we'll pull it in the create pages page method or the element from actions. This is going to allow us to call that create page method in a second with the information that we're going to get from Sanity. So now we want to define our result, which is the information we're going to display that we're pulling in from Sanity. We're going to wait for a response from GraphQL. And the query that we want to pose to GraphQL, we need to work out. So let's jump over to our Gatsby application again over here. Now, if we add in, actually, we need to run Gatsby. Now, I haven't hit save on this yet, so this isn't going to break our Gatsby develop process. Now that Gatsby is running, we can go over to this GraphQL system. So you can see over here we have some references to Sanity already. When Gatsby went through the build process, it looked at the modules we're using, including the source Sanity module and the configuration with that. So it went off to the Sanity service and pulled down the GraphQL configuration that is informing the left-hand side here. So we know that we want to pull out information about the Sanity program. We know that within the edges we'll find the nodes, and in nodes we're going to have the slug, and we want the current slug. So if we run this here now, we can automatically get out a list of all of the slugs, which is the only thing we need to determine which pages we're creating. We can copy this part here, and we'll jump back into our code, and that's the GraphQL. Just give it a bit of nice formatting. That's the GraphQL that we're going to run in order to get the slugs out for us to be able to generate the pages. We want to detect if there are any errors. So if result has any errors, then we'll just throw result dot not exports errors. We'll just throw that straight on. Now what we want to do is go through and find all of the programs that we want to create pages for. So the projects rather. So we'll define programs as the result dot data dot, I'm just going to copy this part, all Sanity program dot edges. So that's going to bring us into this part here. So programs is now a collection of all these nodes. If there's nothing in there, we want to have a catch. So we'll have an empty array. So if this response here gives us null rather than nothing, then we just say, okay, our list is now nothing. We have no programs to display. And then for each of these programs, we're going to grab the edge and the index, which are passed in. We'll define the path to be programs. And then in here, we're going to grab the edge, which is being passed into the for each. We're going to, from the edge, we're going to take node, and just following this through here, we want edge node slug current. The edge node slug current. We're just traversing this GraphQL query here to get the value out. So we're defining the path as being program slash whatever the slug is that we defined in our Sanity data. And now we're going to make a call to that create page method. And into it, we're going to provide the arguments required, which are the path. So what is the path of the page we're creating? what component is it that we're going to render when this path is called. So the component is going to be the resolution of a template file that we'll create. So in source up here, we're going to create a new folder called templates. Make sure I'm still typing in the right place. And we'll create a file in there called program.js. So for every page that we find in Sanity, we're going to render this program. And we're going to render it as being the page that's accessed at this path. Now, we also need to provide some information into this. The program.js by itself at the moment isn't going to have any context around the information that it needs to render. So we need to provide some context into that. So the context in this case is going to be the slug. So that's a named variable that's going into the component that we're going to render. And the value of it is going to be edge.node.slug.current. Right, so that's pretty much it. We're going to create pages. We're going to get the create page method out of the actions that are passed in. We're also going to get a handle on the GraphQL method that allows us to make this query through GraphQL to get all the Sanity programs. The only thing we're interested in getting is the slugs. If there are any errors, we're going to throw it straight through. Otherwise, we're just going to grab all the programs that are returned, or this empty array, which has disappeared. For each of the programs that we then obtain, we loop through them. We define the path for each of those pages. For each path, we then create a page based on the component that's defined in this document here, and the context that we pass into it so the document knows what to render is the slug. So let's go and create this file here now. So in source, we're going to create a new file called template/program.js. So we're going to need to import React from React. We'll also want to import layout from where is it? Components layout. Obviously, we want these pages to look the same as all the other pages in the application. We'll need to import SEO from components SEO. And we're also going to need to import GraphQL because we're going to need to make another query now to pull more information out so we know what to render. And that's going to come from gatsby. When this component gets rendered, we can define a query that's exported from this component, which gets run and then injected into the main component itself. So let's just define that first, and we'll see how that flows in a second. So we'll define a constant query, which is a GraphQL request. And in here, we need to define the information that we're going to get out. So let's just jump back into our GraphQL Explorer. And instead of all Sanity programs here, we're going to just get one Sanity program. Now, if I just run this, we're going to get this error saying, well, actually, first thing is we can't get edges because the Sanity program is just going to return the main information inside node. So we'll have this kind of thing. So if I just run this, we're going to get a Sanity program, but we haven't really defined which one we want to get out. So let's define which one we want, and we can do that by putting a filter in here. So we know that we want one with a slug, and let's say that we want the slug or the slug current rather. So slug current needs to equal, and let's call this program 1. So now, that might need to be double quotes. There we go. So now if we run this, we get, we get program 1 out. Now we want this to not be hard coded, but we want this to be dynamically built based on the information that comes through from the Gatsby node file. So we can define down here some query variables. and we know that the Gatsby node is going to pass through a slug, and let's say that that's going to be program 3 now instead. So we can define up here some parameters that come into my query, which is going to be slug, which is a string, and then here we can pull in equals slug instead. Now we need the $sign in there as well. So now if we hit go on here, we pull out program 3. If I change this down here to program 4 and hit enter, we get program 4. But we want more information than just the slug. So let's have a look at the information that we can pull in from the left-hand side here. We're going to want to pull in the title or the name. So we'll put in name. We want whether or not we don't need to know whether or not it's highlighted here. This is generating the page itself. We're going to generate a page for all of the programs. Down the track, maybe we might have a disable or a hide flag as well. We need the content. The description will be used on the home page. The content is going to be used on the actual page itself. And of course, we want the image. So inside image, we can see that there's crop and hotspot information. There's also asset information. To start with, let's just pull out the URL from the asset and see what that looks like. So now we can see we've got the name program form, we've got the content, which we put in there before. We've got the image, and in the image we have the asset URL. We also have the crop and the hotspot information. These have been added in automatically over on this side here. If we didn't pull those in, then the Sanity Image module, which we'll look at later, wouldn't be able to define where the hotspot is. This information is required to be pulled out later on. We'll leave that for now though, and just pull out the asset URL. So we get the image there. Okay, so let's just copy all of that. So in here, we can take out the name and we can then indent this so it looks nice. Okay, so we've now got to find some GraphQL here, and we're providing the slug, comparing that to using that as a filter. All this information is coming through as it was before. I'm just going to, I like things being in a neat order, and the name comes first for me. So the name is going to go there, the slug underneath, then the content, and then the image, which is probably the order we'll display it in. Maybe the image will go on top, but that seems like a nice way of reading through it now. So now let's define the program component, which we're going to use to generate the output. Now, normally you could just say, look, nothing's going to come in, but we know that something's going to come in. And in fact, what we want to look at is the data that's provided within the object that gets passed into the component. And the data is going to give us the response for the GraphQL query. So in here, we can return. We want to wrap everything in the layout so that it all looks nice. Helps when I use the right brackets, then my autocomplete will work. There we go, end of layout. We want to define the SEO title as being a value that we pull out from data. So data is going to be an object that provides the response inside here. In fact, it's going to start with a Sanity program. So we would normally have to do Sanity program there, which isn't really overly readable. So what we can do is we can name this response here. We can change the name of it by just typing in program : and now we can refer to this as program instead of Sanity program. So that's a little neater and easier to read. At this point here, when we're defining the JSX or the HTML output, we don't really care about whether it being Sanity or not. We just know that we want to get the program information out of the data, and from program we can get the name. And then, because at the moment the header is just hoist, and we can't really say program name hoist, let's put a bit of extra information in as well. We're going to add on programs to the end with a pipe delimiter. Okay, that's going to give us a nice little, we don't need that. Let's just end the SEO tag that way. So the next thing we want to do is we want to display the image. The source of this image is going to be equal to data.program. Now if we follow it down, we've got data.program image asset URL. Now all good images should have an alt. So in here we'll put in data program name for the alt tag. Now we've been using the HTML section tag for applying style to each of the blocks of content that we have. The reason I put the image tag outside of the section tag is I want this to go edge to edge. the section has some padding around it already, or a margin around it rather. So we'll leave the image outside the section tag, but we'll then create a section element here. And inside it we'll have a header, and we'll just print out the program name at this point. And we'll have a paragraph which contains the data.program.content. And then finally we just need to export default program and save that. We need to restart Gatsby at this point because Gatsby is going to go through and execute these GraphQL queries during build time and generate the pages that we want to create. So we need to start the Gatsby develop process over again from scratch. So that's happened. We can now jump back over to our application over here. Now, we don't have any display, any visual cues of this new content. But one of the things that the React app will give us automatically as part of the 404 page is a list of documents that have been created. And we can see over here now that programs 1, 2, 3, and 4 have been created. If I open up program 1, we can see there's a typo there, IAJ. So the downside to this now is I'm actually going to have to rebuild. No, I'm not. There's the image. So we now have the image pulled out and the content from program 1. The reason we didn't need to rebuild at this point, if the GraphQL had an error in it, we would have had to rebuild that. But when the GraphQL is pulled in by Gatsby, it's actually cached in local JSON files. So the program image asset URL already existed in that JSON file, and all we needed to do was correctly address it. So we've now got the image in there for program 2. Program 3, you can see, is bleeding way over the edge there. And program 4, similarly looking very large. So what I'm going to do is we had a class previously defined of full screen, full width, which basically sets the image to 100% of the container. So we've now brought this one down. Program 4 is within the container. Program 3 has that narrower, not as tall aspect ratio, 2 and 1. Now let's jump over to our index page, because with those 4 programs we created, we want to show 3 of them on our index page. And we're going to put that down here underneath the features section. So we'll create a new section, and we'll give it an identifier of programs. And in here, we need to loop through a number of programs, which we don't have access to yet. So let's define what those programs look like. Jumping up to the top of the page, before we start defining the index page component, we're going to export a const called query. And remember again that this will be executed and the results of it injected into the component. And the query is going to be to GraphQL, and the query we want to run is going to be very similar to one of the previous queries we had. So before we had, let's just undo a few of these, we had the all sanity program. Here it is. So we basically want these 4 elements here. What we want to do now is filter them. So let's just come in and grab a few extra things. So we've got we had other information. We didn't have the ID. We're going to need highlighted because this is where we're going to choose whether or not to show it. In fact, we don't. We'll be filtering on highlighted. We'll need description, and we'll want the name, and we'll want the image. So if we run those now, we can see here the highlighted is true, 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 and false. So let's now filter. So we'll add in here a filter, and that filter is going to be on the value of highlighted, and we want to filter where highlighted is equal to true. If we rerun this now, we only get programs 1, 2, and 3. We don't need to pull highlighted out anymore. That was just useful for us to look at it in this moment. We don't need the ID. So this here is looking good. So let's grab this query and put that into our application. That goes in here. So we don't need to prefix with query at this point here. And also I'm going to rename this to programs. So we can reference this as programs.edges.node. Let's just indent this. make it look a little prettier. Index pages, we need to capture that data coming in. So that's the data from the GraphQL query. And down here now we can do data.programs.edges.map. So we want to go through each one of the edges, which is going to give us a program. If we look at the top here again, we can see edges contains the node. Each node is a program. So we're getting each node in. I want to call that a program. And we're going to, for each one of those programs, we're going to render something. So let's wrap everything in the div to start with. And we'll give this a class name of program. And then inside we're going to have a title. And we're going to want to link this title to the slug, but remember we have it in the programs directory. So we're going to want to link it to programs slash followed by the program dot node dot slug dot current. So that's our link for the header. And the header itself is going to be the text which exists in program.node.name. Then we want to have a paragraph. We're going to link the, in fact, we'll put an image in here, but we'll put that in a paragraph tag as well. We want to link this to the same place. So if they click on the image or they click on the title, and in here we're going to insert an image with the source of program.node.image.asset URL. And again, we'll put in an alt tag, which will be program.node.name. And that'll do for the image. And then finally, we want another paragraph down here, getting some errors as I save. We'll look at those in a second. The paragraph is going to be the description. So in here, we just want program.node.description. Right, let's have a look and see what these errors are. So it's expecting on line 82 a return value in the arrow function. Yes, this should be because we're going straight into the JSX here, I'm not doing a return. This should actually be an open brace, not an open bracket rather, open parenthesis, not an open brace. And down here, we want two close parentheses to close these two and then a close brace. So if we save that now, we should have a good build. Now let's jump over to the home page, and down at the bottom, program.node.slug is undefined. Let's have a look at our query. That's because we've got to pull it in up here. So we've got our description, our name, our description. I think we had slug in here, so we want slug current. So I forgot to add that in when we were building the GraphQL before. Now if we refresh this page and we come down, we now have our programs. And if you look at the bottom left-hand corner there, you can see we're linking to programs, program 2, program 1, and program 3. And we've got the correct descriptions here for each of them. And if we click on them, they take us through to the program page. This is looking good. Let's have a look now at how we will resize these images. I think on this page here, obviously this is way too large, it's too tall. I'm happy with the width, but I want to cut that down. When we edited the image over here, we had a focal point on the mountain range for program 1. So I expect when we do the crop, and I think we'll take maybe a third of the height compared to the width. That's 960, we'll make it 320 high, and it should focus on this area here. And on the home page here, that's 300 wide. I think we'll make it 300 by 150. Slightly different aspect ratio, just so we can test that out between the two different views. And that should also focus on this point here, as opposed to zooming straight in on the center. So let's jump into the program first, the individual pages that we're going to edit. The first thing we'll need to do is we'll need to add a new module. So let's run npm install, and we want to pull from Sanity their image URL module. This is going to allow us to generate URLs that get images directly out of their CDN based on parameters that we provide into that object that define the width and the height. Let's see how that works. So on the program page here, we're going to import image URL builder from Sanity Image URL. Now in here, rather than getting the asset URL, the way that the image URL module works is it uses the ID to reference an image. So we're just going to pull out ID. We don't need the URL anymore because we're using the URL builder to generate that for us. Now, as well as the asset information, we're going to need the crop and the hotspot information. This is what allows the URL builder to know where to focus that center point. So for crop, there are the standard, if you think of any cropping tool, standard measures being top, bottom, left, and right. And for the hotspot, we have 4 parameters. We've got X and Y. That's the percentage of the way across. It's a value between 0 and 1, and it's basically like 0.7 is 70% of the way across, and then how far down the image the hotspot occurs. And then each hotspot also has a width and a height, and that creates the ellipse that we saw in the Sanity Studio editor. So that's all we need to pull in. We come down here now, we're going to want to instantiate the image URL builder. So we'll create a builder, and that's going to be the image URL builder. And in here, we need to provide 2 bits of information. First one is the project ID. And this we defined in the environment variables already, which I will copy for convenience. So we've got this one here, so we're looking at process.env.gatsby sanity project ID. We also want to define the data set that we're pulling the image out of. And in this case, that's going to be process.env.sanity dataset. Let's just double check that. Dataset. Yeah. Okay, so we can now come down here. Instead of requesting the image URL directly in here, we can use builder, and on the builder object there's an image method, and into that we basically just pass image. So what this method is going to do is it's going to be passed this information here, and it'll be able to know from the ID what image is being pulled out. It's going to be able to know from the values of top, bottom, left, and right what the maximum area of that image is that it can use. Then it's going to work out where the hotspot is and what the focal point is, and it will then work out, based on other parameters we're about to provide, what size and what area of that photo we want to look at. So in order to define the image ratio that we wanted, we're looking here at the program page. So we're going to have a maximum width of 960 at any time. So let's set the width to 960. And we're going to want to have a matching height of that to be 1/3. So that'll be 320. And from that, we then return the URL, and that URL is generated and passed directly into this image source. So if we just hit save there and restart Gatsby, this is now going to rerun this GraphQL, pull out all the relevant information, and generate the image URL here. So if we jump into the actual page itself and we hit refresh, we now have an image of the dimensions we want, focusing on that point. It's not focusing on the center of the image, it's focusing on this hotspot area. That's great. So similarly, if we look at program 4, which also had a hotspot, we're focused here on the township, as opposed to just the open water that would have been the center. We didn't have hotspots for programs 2 and 3, but if we look at the home page here, we still need to clean these up. So let's duplicate what we've done over here for program. I'm just going to copy the image information into index. We've got the image ID, crop, and hotspot information. We want to copy this bit in because we want to make use of the image URL builder, and then we want to copy this as the source instead. So this one's a little further down here. We've got our image source. Now, instead of 960 by 320, we're going to want something that, if this is 960, then each of these is probably around about 300. So let's make them 300 by 150. So if we save that and switch straight over, we've got an issue. Builder is not defined. We need to copy the builder in. I didn't do that part. Let's grab this, put that at the top. So in our index page now, we've changed this to define the image URL builder. We've changed the GraphQL to pull in the asset ID, the crop, and the hotspot information. And then down at the bottom, where we iterated through each of the programs and output those, the image source has now been changed again to be that image builder, providing a link directly to the image from the GraphQL response and setting the width to 300, the height to 150, and then getting the generated URL for that. We hit save, we get a success, and if we refresh this page now, we still have an issue. Okay, so data program is undefined. Of course, that's because we're in this loop here. We're going through data programs here. We're mapping to program, so we only actually need program dot node dot image. In the same way as we've got program.node.slug, we have program.node.image now. And now if we refresh this page, here we go. We've now got our 3 images. We're focused on that part there. Program 2 didn't have a hotspot. Program 3 didn't have a hotspot. I'm loving how relatively quickly I managed to get this information in from Sanity, including setting up the local Sanity Studio. The next thing I want to do is to add information around the plans that people can subscribe to. In episode 4, we're going to be integrating Stripe, and we need to have some information ahead of that time so to make that integration easier. So let's jump back into the Sanity configuration and add the plan schema. So I want to add plan. I want to import plan from plan. We don't have plan yet though, so let's just create that new plan.js. In here we're going to export default, so it's going to have a title of plan. The name is going to be plan, and the type, because it's the top level, is the document. Now we're going to have a number of elements as similar to what we have in program. We have a name, a slug, a description. Those are all things that we're going to need. I'm just going to define the fields here as an array containing these elements. Name string slug, which we're going to source from name and description. The other thing we're going to need to know is a monthly amount. Now this will be stored in Stripe, and Stripe allows you to have multiple currencies, and plans can have different prices depending on that currency. So perhaps we'll pull that out of there in the future, but for now I'm going to put a monthly donation amount into Sanity's configuration. And the type is going to be a number. Now I don't want somebody to be able to use the Sanity Studio to create a new plan in the future and have a negative amount. So we're going to add a validation rule in here, and we're going to define the rule as having being required and a minimum value of 0. And then finally, we want to have that link to Stripe. So Stripe has a payment plan identifier, and we need to link this plan to that payment plan. So we'll define a Stripe pricing plan rather. The type of this, I'm just going to make it a string. I don't think it'll change. It's probably going to be a string. I don't know what the validation is. We could add that later, but for now we've added these in. If I just hit save on schema now, and we jump back in over here, this should have reloaded, so we now have plan as a content type as well. We don't have any plan content though, so let's create some plan items. I'm going to create a single plan for $10, a couples plan for $20, and a family plan for $35. We'll give them a bit of a discount. Okay, we've got those all defined in there now. We need to generate the new GraphQL though. Remember, we've made changes to the schema, and the API needs to be aware of these. So let's run Sanity GraphQL deploy again, and that's going to push the information up into the Sanity API. Meanwhile, we need to jump over to our Hoist tab over here, and let's just restart Gatsby. This is going to pull the new GraphQL schema down from Sanity so that we can jump into our GraphQL Explorer over here and have a look. We can see now that plan has arrived on the left, and from edges, nodes, we can get the name, the description, the monthly donation, and the Stripe pricing plan ID. If we run that, here we go, we've got the single, the couples, and the family. So let's generate static pages for each of these plans. Let's jump back into Gatsby node over here, and we need to duplicate the code we have here for generating the static program pages to generate the static plan pages. I'm going to rename this result first because it's quite generic and we want to create a second GraphQL query in a second. So this is going to be program result. Now let's copy this code and we'll duplicate just that. And let's go through. So we want this to be plan result. All Sanity plan result. Just copy that. We want the plans here. This needs to be all Sanity plan. And the component we want to use to generate the content is the plan.js. So let's come over here in templates and we'll create a new file called plan.js. We'll need to import React from React. We'll need layout from components layout. We'll need SEO from components SEO, and we need GraphQL from Gatsby. So let's define our query. Into this, we're going to be providing the slug. So I'm just going to come over here for convenience, and I'm going to grab this query, and we'll just modify that to be for our plan here. We're passing the query in, and we want to give it a name of plan, and we're going to pull out a Sanity plan based on the slug being equal to the slug. Instead of name, slug, content, etc., we just want name, description, monthly pricing plan. So this is the information we want to render on the screen. And now we want to define the plan component. So remember, we're going to have the data passed into us, which is the injected information from GraphQL. And we want to return everything wrapped in our layout. And we need to set the SEO title to data.plan.name, and we'll add on to that plans. And now we need to define a section to contain this information in. Remember, that's how we're doing some of our styling. Now we want a header. We'll make it a header 2. That's going to be data.plan.name. We want the description. That's going to be data.plan.description. Oops, close that brace. We've got our monthly donation. So we'll just prefix this so we know what it's about. Stick in the $sign, and that's going to be data.plan. I'm just going to paste this to save my typing skills. And finally, we now have a button. So this is what's going to allow us to actually subscribe to this plan. So let's create a button, and we'll put in here subscribe now. We have an on-click handler in here. So on-click, we want to call a function, and that function is going to call a function we'll define at the top there, subscribe, and into it we're going to pass we're just going to pass the whole plan in. So then here we can define our subscribe function and into it we're going to receive the plan. And what we want to do, for now, let's just do an alert. We don't really have anything else to do. We're just going to alert the plan.stripe pricing plan ID. Let's hit save on that. We're getting an error, which possibly could be because this GraphQL query is based on information that hasn't been pulled in. And also we've changed our Gatsby node. So let's just restart Gatsby. Okay, we've got an error here because I used the wrong kind of quotes. It happens when I type while I'm talking. Plan is assigned a value but never used. Yes, we need to export default plan. Let's save that. That's rebuilding. I'm just going to stop and start it again so the whole build process can work now through the Gatsby node create page process. That looks like it's built. Let's jump back into our browser. Application is running. Of course, we don't have any links to it yet, so let's have a look at the 404 page. We can now see the 3 plan pages here, couples, family, and single. Each of them has the information from the template and the button which shows us the Stripe ID. There it is. So we have the plans defined now that people can subscribe to, and we've got information down here about the programs that will be supported if they subscribe. That's what I'm going to leave it for today. In the next episode, I'll be looking at creating an Express API in order to talk to the Auth0 management API, which will allow us to do things like store information against the user in the app metadata area of Auth0. What that does is allows us to store information against the user that the user can't edit, but allows us to remember for episode 4 what their Stripe customer ID is. So we're going to get to a point where we're using Auth0 and Stripe and Gatsby, but we're not actually using our own database yet. The information about the subscriptions and the payments all goes into Stripe. The information about the Stripe customer ID, that link, goes into Auth0. So when I log into Auth0, I can pull out the Stripe customer ID and I'll know exactly what my plan is. We'll look at that more into that in episode 4. Episode 3 will be building the Express API. Thanks for joining me. I hope you've learned things. If you've got any questions, hit me up in the comments below. I look forward to seeing you next time. Hey, are you a web developer? Do you care about security and privacy? Are you interested in the Internet of Things? And what about videography and streaming? Well, these are just some of the things that I talk about on my channel. There's a couple of videos over here that you might be interested in, but until next time, thanks for joining me and have fun.